On the 24th of April 1963, a princess walked into Westminster Abbey to marry a man who had just turned down the chance to become an earl. Something like 200 million people were said to be following it in one form or another, and the story they were following was the easiest one the House of Windsor had told in years. Here was Alexandra of Kent, the cousin everybody actually liked, the one with no scandal attached to her name, and a smile the newsreels could not get enough of. And here was Angus Ogilvy, a businessman so quietly sensible that when the palace floated the idea of a title to go with the marriage, he said no thank you and went back to his directorships. A princess who behaved, and a groom who declined the ermine. For an institution that had spent the previous 30 years cleaning up after an abdication, a wartime plane crash, and a younger royal who had wanted to marry entirely the wrong divorced man, this was practically a holiday. That was the first wedding. The second one came 26 years later, in a small church across the river in Ham, with almost none of the same faces in the pews, and none of the same warmth in the coverage. The bride was the Ogilvys' own daughter. She was heavily pregnant, she was barely on speaking terms with her parents, and she had just told a national newspaper, in some detail, exactly what she believed they had wanted her to do about the child she was carrying. One of these weddings was performed for the world as a fairy tale. The other was performed to be survived. The official version of the Ogilvy marriage is that it was the sane one, the steady one. Decades of unshowy public duty, a husband who kept clear of the royal spotlight and made his own living rather than drawing on the public purse, and a household that never once turned up in the sort of headline that made courtiers reach for the brandy. That is the version in the polite biographies, and the genuinely remarkable thing about it is that most of it is true. Alexandra really was, for the better part of half a century, the hardest working and least complained about member of the entire family. But the tidy version has a habit of leaving two things out. It leaves out the corporate scandal that came within a breath of parading the princess's husband in front of the country as the living symbol of everything rotten about British capitalism. And it leaves out the long, quiet, corrosive distance between a mother and a daughter that in the end got settled in the newspapers instead of the drawing room, because the newspapers were the only place left to settle it. So this is a story about two weddings and the strange stretch of years between them. It is about a marriage that genuinely worked, attached to a family that, at least once or twice, very publicly did not. And it is about the small, uncomfortable fact at the center of the whole thing, the one the Ogilvys spent the longest time managing. The marriage everyone admired eventually produced a marriage nobody was supposed to talk about. And the family involved was, of all the families in Britain, the one that should have known best how to keep such things quiet, because keeping royal things quiet had been the family trade for generations. If you like your history with the varnish scraped off, take a second to subscribe before we go on, because the gap between those two weddings is where the whole story lives. To understand why the Ogilvy marriage mattered, and why the trouble inside it was so awkward when it came, you have to start with the family that produced the groom, because they were not outsiders. The romantic idea of a princess marrying a commoner suggests some gap being crossed, some ordinary man being lifted up into a world he did not belong to. Nothing of the kind happened in 1963. Angus Ogilvy was a commoner in the strict technical sense that he held no title of his own, and in no other sense whatsoever. He was the second son of the 12th Earl of Airlie, from a Scottish family whose seat at Cortacky Castle in Angus had been standing since long before most of the crowned heads of Europe had heard of one another. And more to the point, his family had spent the better part of a century inside the royal household itself, close enough to the throne to know exactly how the machinery worked, and trusted enough to be handed the levers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His grandmother is the place to begin. Mabel Ogilvy, Countess of Airlie, was for more than 50 years one of the closest companions Queen Mary ever had. She was Lady of the Bedchamber, which is one of those court titles that sounds decorative and is in fact enormously significant, because it meant she was in the room. She was the woman Queen Mary talked to when Queen Mary needed to talk to someone. She was widowed young, her husband the 11th Earl killed in the South African War at the turn of the century, and she gave the long remainder of her life to the service of a monarchy that was, across those decades, dealing with rather a lot. She was there through the reign of one king and into the next. She was there, by her own later account and by the accounts of others, as a quiet fixture in the private life of a family that showed the public almost nothing of its private life. Late in her own life, she wrote a memoir, and the title she gave it was Thatched with Gold, which is the sort of detail you could not invent, given where her grandson would eventually make his home. She died in the middle of the 1950s, having outlasted the abdication, 2 world wars, and most of the people she had started out serving. Now hold that image, because it explains something about the whole story that follows. The Airlie family were not people who stumbled into proximity with the crown. They were people who had made proximity to the crown their inheritance. And what proximity to that particular crown taught you, above almost everything else, was discretion. You saw things. You said nothing. You watched the family through its worst private hours, and you carried what you saw out of the room, and you locked it somewhere, and you never opened the drawer again. Mabel Airlie was, in her way, a professional keeper of the family's secrets, and she was very good at it, and she raised sons and grandsons inside that culture of silence. One of those grandsons was Angus. Another was his elder brother David, who would grow up to become the 13th Earl of Airlie, and who would then do something that closes the circle almost too neatly. He became Lord Chamberlain. The Lord Chamberlain is the most senior official of the royal household, the person who runs the whole apparatus, the ceremonial and the practical, and a good deal of the discreet business in between. David Ogilvy held that post for well over a decade, straight through the years when the House of Windsor came closer to falling apart in public than it had at any point since his own grandmother's day. So consider the shape of it. The grandmother kept Queen Mary's confidences, the elder brother ran the Queen's household, and the second son married the Queen's first cousin. There has hardly ever been a family so thoroughly woven into the private fabric of the British monarchy, so completely on the inside, so fluent in the specific art of managing what the public was and was not allowed to see. Which is exactly why it is worth pausing on. When the trouble came to the Ogilvys, and it came twice, the family had no need to learn how these things were handled. They had been handling them, for other people, for 3 generations. It is worth staying with Mabel for a moment longer, because the more you understand what she actually was, the more you understand the family Angus came from, and the more the eventual irony of the story sharpens. She served Queen Mary from the early years of the century, when Mary was still the Princess of Wales, all the way through to the reign of the present Queen's father, more than half a century of continuous, intimate service to the same woman. That is an almost unimaginable span. She was there when Mary became queen. She was there through the Great War. She was there when Mary's own son gave up the throne, and she was there in the long, strange aftermath, when the family had to reassemble itself around a king who had never expected to be king and a queen consort who had never expected to be queen. And through all of it, Mabel Airlie was the person Queen Mary could speak to honestly, one of the very few, because Mabel had the two qualities that the role above all required, which were sympathy and silence. She would listen, and she would never, ever repeat. She was, by some accounts, more than a listener. When Mary's second son, the shy and stammering Prince Albert, was courting Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the young Scottish aristocrat who would eventually become the Queen Mother, Mabel Airlie is often credited with having helped the match along, having smoothed the way, having been a quiet and encouraging presence at the edges of a courtship that mattered enormously to the future of the monarchy, given what was coming. How large a role she really played is one of those things that is easier to assert than to prove, so take it as the fond version rather than the documented one. But the point stands regardless. This was a woman positioned at the very heart of the family's most private business, trusted with its most delicate arrangements, and she carried that trust to her grave, keeping the confidences of a queen for 50 years, and then, when she was very old, writing a memoir that was notable precisely for how much it declined to reveal. She called that memoir Thatched with Gold, which is a phrase worth holding on to, given that her grandson would one day raise his family in a house in a royal park called Thatched House Lodge. The family kept turning up under the same roofs, doing the same discreet work, for generation after generation. And then there was David, Angus's elder brother, who took the theme and carried it further than anyone. David Ogilvy inherited the earldom, became the 13th Earl of Airlie, and in the middle of the 1980s he was appointed to the single most senior position in the entire royal household. He became Lord Chamberlain. It is a title that most people have heard and few people understand, so it is worth spelling out what it means, because it is genuinely staggering in the context of this story. The Lord Chamberlain is not a ceremonial ornament. He is the man who runs the machine. He is the head of the Queen's household, responsible for the whole vast apparatus of the monarchy, the staff, the ceremonies, the state occasions, the practical and delicate business of making the institution function day after day. When there is a royal wedding or a state funeral, the Lord Chamberlain is the one who makes it happen. When there is a crisis, he is one of the small handful of people in the room where it is managed. He is, in effect, the chief executive of the crown. David Ogilvy held that post for well over a decade, from the middle of the 1980s into the late 1990s. Which means he ran the royal household through the single worst stretch the modern monarchy has ever endured. He was Lord Chamberlain during the years when the marriages of the Queen's children came apart in public, one after another, in a slow-motion catastrophe that the Queen herself would eventually describe, in a famous phrase, as a horrible year. He was there for the separations and the scandals and the leaked tapes and the confessional interviews. He was there when Windsor Castle caught fire. He was there through the whole long humiliation of the early 1990s, when the institution seemed, for a time, to be dissolving in front of the cameras. And it was David Ogilvy, more than almost anyone, who was tasked with holding the machine together while it happened, and with quietly modernizing it so that it might survive. He led a sweeping review of how the royal household was run and paid for, dragging the ancient finances of the monarchy toward something a modern public might tolerate, and it was on his watch, and with his involvement, that the Queen made the extraordinary decision to begin paying income tax like everyone else, a change that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. He was, in the fullest sense, the man managing the monarchy's darkest hour, keeping its secrets, tending its wounds, holding the surface together while the whole thing shook. So keep the full picture in view, because nothing about the Ogilvy story lands properly without it. The grandmother kept the Queen's confidences for half a century. The brother ran the entire household through the worst crisis the crown has known and helped keep it standing, and the second son married into the family and became, in a modest way, part of the family himself. This was not a family that admired the monarchy from a respectful distance. This was a family that lived inside the monarchy's private machinery, that had made the keeping of royal secrets its hereditary occupation, that knew, better than almost any family alive, exactly how an embarrassment is smothered, and a surface is maintained, and a difficult truth is kept off the front page. Which is precisely why it is so pointed, so almost unbearably ironic, that when the difficult truths came for the Ogilvys themselves, all that expertise turned out to have its limits. The keepers of the secrets were about to become the subject of them, and they were about to learn the one thing that even the best keeper of secrets cannot control. Angus himself was born in the autumn of 1928, which made him a small boy during the abdication crisis, and a schoolboy through the war. He went to Eton, as the men of his family did, and then to Trinity College at Oxford, and then he did the thing that second sons of the aristocracy had always been quietly expected to do, which was to go and make himself useful somewhere that did not involve inheriting the title, because the title and the land were going to his brother. A first son gets the castle, a second son gets a career and a pat on the back. So Angus went into business, into the city, into the world of company boards and merchant finance and the long lunches where the real decisions of post-war British capitalism were actually made. And he was, by the standards of that world, a success. By the time he began to be seriously linked with a princess, he was a serious man of business, sitting on the boards of a great many companies, respectable, well-connected, established. He did not need the monarchy for money. He had his own. That single fact, which sounds minor, is going to matter enormously in a moment, because it is the thing that shaped the entire public story of his marriage. But before the marriage, there is the bride, and Alexandra came from her own family of hushed private histories, which is one of the quiet ironies nobody put on the wedding program. She was born on the 25th of December 1936, which means she arrived into the world a fortnight after her uncle had handed over a throne. The abdication was that fresh. The ink was barely dry on the instrument by which Edward VIII had given up the crown for Wallace Simpson, and the family was still reeling from it, still absorbing the shock of a king who had simply walked out, when Princess Marina, Duchess of Kent, gave birth to a daughter on Christmas Day. It is a strange thing to be born into a family in the exact week it has been most publicly humiliated, and Alexandra's whole childhood would be shaped, one way or another, by the aftershocks of that humiliation, by a monarchy that had decided, in the wake of the abdication, that it could not afford ever again to let its private life become a public spectacle. Her father made that lesson a little harder to keep. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was the glamorous one of his generation, the fourth son of King George V, the brother with the film star looks and the wide social circle, and the private life that the palace spent a good deal of energy keeping out of view. The stories about him have circulated for decades, some better sourced than others, and in fairness to a man who cannot answer them, a great deal of what gets repeated about the Duke of Kent's private conduct sits in the category of rumor rather than record, so it is only honest to flag it as such. What is not in dispute is that he was a figure of genuine glamour and genuine complication, a royal whose life did not fit neatly into the tidy family portrait the institution wanted to present, and whose difficulties were managed, quietly, by the same machinery that managed everyone else's. Alexandra was his only daughter, and she was 5 years old when he was killed. He died in August 1942, in the middle of the war, when the Royal Air Force flying boat carrying him to Iceland came down on a hillside in the north of Scotland in poor weather. Almost everyone aboard died. The Duke of Kent was 39. It was a genuine national tragedy, a serving royal killed on active duty, and it left Princess Marina a widow with 3 young children, of whom Alexandra was the middle one and the only girl. So the reliable, cheerful, scandal-free princess that Britain would come to love in the 1960s grew up without a father, in the long shadow of a war, inside a family that had learned to keep its private grief and its private difficulty strictly behind closed doors. She learned discretion, too, from the other side of it. She learned it as the person being protected, rather than the person doing the protecting. And in a sense, the marriage of 1963 was the meeting of 2 people who had each, from opposite ends, been raised inside the same culture of silence. It is hard, from this distance, to convey how deeply the abdication had frightened the institution into which Alexandra was born, and how completely it shaped everything the family did afterward, so it is worth pausing on it, because it is the invisible weather behind the whole of Alexandra's life. When Edward VIII gave up the throne at the end of 1936 to marry a twice-divorced American, he did not merely cause a scandal. He exposed, in the most catastrophic possible way, the thing the monarchy could least afford to have exposed, which was that its private life could override its public duty, that the man at the center of the whole edifice could simply put his own desire first and walk away, and that the entire apparatus of crown and government and church could do nothing to stop him except let him go. It shook the monarchy to its foundations. It very nearly broke it, and the family that had to pick up the pieces, the reluctant new king and his wife and his mother Queen Mary, drew from the wreckage a single overriding lesson that they would enforce with something close to religious severity for the rest of their lives. Never again would the private be allowed to endanger the public. Never again would a royal be permitted to let personal feeling threaten the institution. Never again would the family's private business be allowed to become a public spectacle. Duty first, always, and everything else, every human want and weakness and difficulty, was to be managed strictly, privately, silently, behind the closed doors where such things belonged. That was the doctrine Alexandra was born into, a fortnight after the crisis that produced it, and it is the doctrine she would live by more faithfully than almost anyone. It is why her decades of uncomplaining public work meant so much to the family, and it is why the eventual troubles around her marriage cut so deep, because they were, each in their own way, exactly the thing the doctrine existed to prevent: the private breaking through into the public, where it was never supposed to go. Her mother had learned a harder version of the same lesson, from a different direction entirely, because Princess Marina came from a royal family that had not merely been embarrassed but destroyed. Marina was born a princess of Greece and Denmark, into a Greek royal house that spent the first decades of the 20th century being repeatedly thrown off its throne, restored, and thrown off again, in a dizzying cycle of coups and exiles and instability that scattered its members across Europe as dispossessed royalty living on memory and connection. She knew, from her own childhood, what it was to be royal and to have the ground fall away beneath you, to be a princess of a country that did not want your family, to live the elegant, precarious, slightly rootless existence of the exiled royal, keeping up appearances on shrinking means. She was famous when she married into the British family in the 1930s for her extraordinary style and poise, and much was made at the time of how she brought a continental glamour to a rather stuffy court. But underneath the glamour was the hard practical knowledge of someone who had watched a monarchy collapse and understood that nothing was guaranteed, that appearances had to be maintained precisely because the substance underneath could vanish, that a royal woman's whole security rested on things that could be taken away. And then her husband was killed, and she found herself in the oldest and loneliest position the royal women of that century seemed forever to be falling into, the position of the widow left to carry on. She was widowed young, with 3 children and a diminished income, and a life that had suddenly lost its center, and she had to raise those children, including her only daughter, inside the exacting culture of a family that expected duty and dignity and the swallowing of private grief. She did it with characteristic style and characteristic strictness. She was, by the accounts of the period, an elegant and formidable mother, exacting in her standards, determined that her children would be a credit to a family that had already suffered enough embarrassment, careful with money in the way that people who have known real precarity are careful, and absolutely committed to the code of discretion that the whole family lived by. This was the woman who raised Alexandra, a dispossessed Greek princess who had seen a throne fall, married into a British family reeling from an abdication, widowed by a wartime crash, teaching her daughter that whatever you feel, you keep it behind the door. Alexandra learned the lesson thoroughly. She would spend her life as the living proof of it, and her own daughter one day would spend a very public few weeks proving that the lesson had not, after all, taken in the generation below. Marina raised her children carefully and, by the standards of the family, unconventionally. Alexandra became the first British princess to be sent away to a proper boarding school, Heathfield, rather than being taught entirely at home by governesses in the old royal fashion. She was then finished in Paris, given a continental polish, exposed to a slightly wider world than most royal girls of her generation. The effect of all this was to produce a young woman who was recognizably a person, who could hold a room, who had a sense of humor and a warmth that came across as real rather than rehearsed. When she began, as a young woman, to take on public engagements on behalf of the family, the response was immediate and genuine. People liked her. Not in the dutiful way that the public is supposed to like minor royals, but actually. She was pretty without being intimidating, dignified without being cold, and she carried the specific quality that the newsreels loved, which was that she appeared to be enjoying herself. That quality was worth a great deal to an institution that had spent the post-war years worrying about its own relevance. The abdication had frightened them. The war had exhausted them. The 1950s had brought the Townsend affair, in which the Queen's own sister, Princess Margaret, had wanted to marry a divorced man, Group Captain Peter Townsend, and had been, in effect, prevented from doing so by the combined weight of the church and the government and the family, and had been made to renounce him in public in a manner that satisfied nobody and left a lasting bruise. The institution had watched that play out and had drawn its conclusions. What it wanted, above almost anything, was royals who did not cause trouble, royals who married suitably, behaved predictably, worked hard, and gave the newspapers nothing but the pictures the palace wanted the newspapers to have. And in Alexandra, they had exactly that. She was the answer to the problem the family had been worrying about since before she was born. She was the princess who behaved. The timing helped too, because Alexandra came of marriageable age at a moment when the monarchy was consciously trying to reinvent itself for a new decade, and a glamorous, popular, unproblematic royal wedding was exactly the kind of thing the institution wanted to be able to offer. The 1960s were beginning, and Britain was changing fast, becoming younger and louder and less deferential, and there was a real anxiety inside the palace that the monarchy risked looking like a dusty relic of a vanished age. The answer, or part of it, was to lean into the family's younger members, to let a little of the decade's glamour attach itself to the crown, to present the royal family not as a museum, but as a living, attractive, modern thing. And royal weddings were the perfect vehicle for that. Because a wedding is glamour and continuity and reassurance all at once. A spectacle that says the family goes on, the story continues, the future is secure. There was, in fact, a small cluster of these glamorous royal weddings in those years, and Alexandra's was one of them. Just a few years before, the Queen's own sister, Princess Margaret, had married the photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones in a wedding that had caused a sensation of its own, partly because it was the first royal wedding to be widely televised, partly because Armstrong Jones was a fashionable society photographer rather than a duke, a figure of the modern, artistic, slightly bohemian London that the decade was producing. That marriage was the palace's first real experiment in presenting the monarchy as young and fashionable and in tune with the times, and Alexandra's, coming shortly after, extended the same project. Here again was a princess marrying a man who was not a foreign prince or a grand duke, but a figure from the ordinary, if extremely well-connected, British establishment, a businessman rather than a royal, a match that could be presented as modern and grounded and sensible. But there was a crucial difference between the two weddings, and it is a difference that matters for everything that follows, because it turns on that same question of titles. When Armstrong Jones married Margaret, he accepted a title. He was created Earl of Snowdon, precisely so that he and his royal wife would share a rank, and so that their children would be properly styled, would have courtesy titles of their own, would be woven into the peerage and the aristocratic order. Their son and daughter grew up as a viscount and a lady, titled, placed, secure in a recognized rank. Angus Ogilvy, offered the same kind of elevation to go with the same kind of marriage, refused it. And that single divergence, Snowden saying yes and on the 24th of April 1963, a princess walked into Westminster Abbey to marry a man who had just turned down the chance to become an earl. Something like 200 million people were said to be following it in one form or another, and the story they were following was the easiest one the House of Windsor had told in years. Here was Alexandra of Kent, the cousin everybody actually liked, the one with no scandal attached to her name, and a smile the newsreels could not get enough of. And here was Angus Ogilvy, a businessman so quietly sensible that when the palace floated the idea of a title to go with the marriage, he said no thank you and went back to his directorships. A princess who behaved, and a groom who declined the ermine. For an institution that had spent the previous 30 years cleaning up after an abdication, a wartime plane crash, and a younger royal who had wanted to marry entirely the wrong divorced man, this was practically a holiday. That was the first wedding. The second one came 26 years later, in a small church across the river in Ham, with almost none of the same faces in the pews, and none of the same warmth in the coverage. The bride was the Ogilvys' own daughter. She was heavily pregnant, she was barely on speaking terms with her parents, and she had just told a national newspaper, in some detail, exactly what she believed they had wanted her to do about the child she was carrying. One of these weddings was performed for the world as a fairy tale. The other was performed to be survived. The official version of the Ogilvy marriage is that it was the sane one, the steady one. Decades of unshowy public duty, a husband who kept clear of the royal spotlight and made his own living rather than drawing on the public purse, and a household that never once turned up in the sort of headline that made courtiers reach for the brandy. That is the version in the polite biographies, and the genuinely remarkable thing about it is that most of it is true. Alexandra really was, for the better part of half a century, the hardest working and least complained about member of the entire family. But the tidy version has a habit of leaving two things out. It leaves out the corporate scandal that came within a breath of parading the princess's husband in front of the country as the living symbol of everything rotten about British capitalism. And it leaves out the long, quiet, corrosive distance between a mother and a daughter that in the end got settled in the newspapers instead of the drawing room, because the newspapers were the only place left to settle it. So this is a story about two weddings and the strange stretch of years between them. It is about a marriage that genuinely worked, attached to a family that, at least once or twice, very publicly did not. And it is about the small, uncomfortable fact at the center of the whole thing, the one the Ogilvys spent the longest time managing. The marriage everyone admired eventually produced a marriage nobody was supposed to talk about. And the family involved was, of all the families in Britain, the one that should have known best how to keep such things quiet, because keeping royal things quiet had been the family trade for generations. If you like your history with the varnish scraped off, take a second to subscribe before we go on, because the gap between those two weddings is where the whole story lives. To understand why the Ogilvy marriage mattered, and why the trouble inside it was so awkward when it came, you have to start with the family that produced the groom, because they were not outsiders. The romantic idea of a princess marrying a commoner suggests some gap being crossed, some ordinary man being lifted up into a world he did not belong to. Nothing of the kind happened in 1963. Angus Ogilvy was a commoner in the strict technical sense that he held no title of his own, and in no other sense whatsoever. He was the second son of the 12th Earl of Airlie, from a Scottish family whose seat at Cortacky Castle in Angus had been standing since long before most of the crowned heads of Europe had heard of one another. And more to the point, his family had spent the better part of a century inside the royal household itself, close enough to the throne to know exactly how the machinery worked, and trusted enough to be handed the levers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His grandmother is the place to begin. Mabel Ogilvy, Countess of Airlie, was for more than 50 years one of the closest companions Queen Mary ever had. She was Lady of the Bedchamber, which is one of those court titles that sounds decorative and is in fact enormously significant, because it meant she was in the room. She was the woman Queen Mary talked to when Queen Mary needed to talk to someone. She was widowed young, her husband, the 11th Earl, killed in the South African War at the turn of the century, and she gave the long remainder of her life to the service of a monarchy that was, across those decades, dealing with rather a lot. She was there through the reign of one king and into the next. She was there, by her own later account and by the accounts of others, as a quiet fixture in the private life of a family that showed the public almost nothing of its private life. Late in her own life, she wrote a memoir, and the title she gave it was Thatched with Gold, which is the sort of detail you could not invent, given where her grandson would eventually make his home. She died in the middle of the 1950s, having outlasted the abdication, 2 world wars, and most of the people she had started out serving. Now hold that image, because it explains something about the whole story that follows. The Airlie family were not people who stumbled into proximity with the crown. They were people who had made proximity to the crown their inheritance. And what proximity to that particular crown taught you, above almost everything else, was discretion. You saw things. You said nothing. You watched the family through its worst private hours, and you carried what you saw out of the room, and you locked it somewhere, and you never opened the drawer again. Mabel Airlie was, in her way, a professional keeper of the family's secrets, and she was very good at it, and she raised sons and grandsons inside that culture of silence. One of those grandsons was Angus. Another was his elder brother David, who would grow up to become the 13th Earl of Airlie, and who would then do something that closes the circle almost too neatly. He became Lord Chamberlain. The Lord Chamberlain is the most senior official of the royal household, the person who runs the whole apparatus, the ceremonial and the practical, and a good deal of the discreet business in between. David Ogilvy held that post for well over a decade, straight through the years when the House of Windsor came closer to falling apart in public than it had at any point since his own grandmother's day. So consider the shape of it. The grandmother kept Queen Mary's confidences, the elder brother ran the Queen's household, and the second son married the Queen's first cousin. There has hardly ever been a family so thoroughly woven into the private fabric of the British monarchy, so completely on the inside, so fluent in the specific art of managing what the public was and was not allowed to see. Which is exactly why it is worth pausing on. When the trouble came to the Ogilvys, and it came twice, the family had no need to learn how these things were handled. They had been handling them, for other people, for 3 generations. It is worth staying with Mabel for a moment longer, because the more you understand what she actually was, the more you understand the family Angus came from, and the more the eventual irony of the story sharpens. She served Queen Mary from the early years of the century, when Mary was still the Princess of Wales, all the way through to the reign of the present Queen's father, more than half a century of continuous, intimate service to the same woman. That is an almost unimaginable span. She was there when Mary became queen. She was there through the Great War. She was there when Mary's own son gave up the throne, and she was there in the long, strange aftermath, when the family had to reassemble itself around a king who had never expected to be king and a queen consort who had never expected to be queen. And through all of it, Mabel Airlie was the person Queen Mary could speak to honestly, one of the very few, because Mabel had the two qualities that the role above all required, which were sympathy and silence. She would listen, and she would never, ever repeat. She was, by some accounts, more than a listener. When Mary's second son, the shy and stammering Prince Albert, was courting Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the young Scottish aristocrat who would eventually become the Queen Mother, Mabel Airlie is often credited with having helped the match along, having smoothed the way, having been a quiet and encouraging presence at the edges of a courtship that mattered enormously to the future of the monarchy, given what was coming. How large a role she really played is one of those things that is easier to assert than to prove, so take it as the fond version rather than the documented one. But the point stands regardless. This was a woman positioned at the very heart of the family's most private business, trusted with its most delicate arrangements, and she carried that trust to her grave, keeping the confidences of a queen for 50 years, and then, when she was very old, writing a memoir that was notable precisely for how much it declined to reveal. She called that memoir "Thatched with Gold," which is a phrase worth holding on to, given that her grandson would one day raise his family in a house in a royal park called Thatched House Lodge. The family kept turning up under the same roofs, doing the same discreet work, for generation after generation. And then there was David, Angus's elder brother, who took the theme and carried it further than anyone. David Ogilvy inherited the earldom, became the 13th Earl of Airlie, and in the middle of the 1980s he was appointed to the single most senior position in the entire royal household. He became Lord Chamberlain. It is a title that most people have heard and few people understand, so it is worth spelling out what it means. And Alexandra worked. This is the thing that has to be said clearly, because it is the genuine achievement at the center of her whole public life, the thing that no amount of irony about the family's troubles should be allowed to obscure. She was, for decades, one of the most industrious members of the royal family, quietly carrying an enormous load of the ordinary, unglamorous, endless engagements that keep the institution functioning. The hospital visits, the charity patronages, the overseas tours to places that mattered and generated no headlines, the ribbon cuttings and the receptions, and the long afternoons of being pleasant to strangers, which is far harder and far more draining than it looks. She did the work that nobody photographs and nobody remembers, year after year after year, without complaint and without much reward, and she did it with a reliability that made her, within the palace, one of the most valued figures in the whole extended family. If the Queen needed something covered, somewhere visited, some cause supported, Alexandra could be counted on. She was the safe pair of hands. She was the one who never let anyone down. Angus, meanwhile, built his own life alongside hers, keeping his promise to remain his own man. He continued in business, sitting on boards, moving in the city, maintaining the career that his refusal of a title had been meant to protect. And for a while this too looked like the ideal arrangement. The modern royal marriage, in which the husband was not a kept man but a working one, contributing his own money and his own achievements, rather than living on the public and the palace. Two people, two careers, one comfortable family, no scandal. The 1960s turned into the 1970s. The image held. It is worth understanding what Angus's career actually consisted of, because the shape of it is what led him, eventually, into trouble, and because it says something about the world he moved in. He was, in the language of the time, a city man, which meant he inhabited the dense, clubbable, deeply interconnected world of London finance, the world of merchant banks and company boards, and the old boy networks that still, in those decades, ran a very large part of British business through personal connection and mutual trust. And what a well-born, well-connected, capable man did in that world, above all, was collect directorships. He sat on the boards of companies. Not one company, but many, sometimes a great many, lending his name and his connections and his judgment to enterprise after enterprise, drawing fees and prestige, becoming one of those figures whose value lay partly in competence and partly in the simple respectability of having them associated with your firm. To have a man like Angus Ogilvy on your board, a man of impeccable background, married after 1963 to a princess, was to acquire a certain kind of reassurance, a signal to the world that your company was sound and respectable, and the sort of thing serious people were involved with. There is a blind spot built into that whole arrangement, and it is the blind spot that the Lonhro affair would expose so painfully. A man who sits on many boards cannot possibly know, in real detail, what every one of those companies is actually doing. His involvement is necessarily part-time, necessarily somewhat distant, a matter of attending meetings and reading papers and trusting the executives who run the business day to day. The respectability he lends is real, and it is precisely the point, but it can also become a kind of decoration, a name at the top of the notepaper that reassures the public while the actual conduct of the business goes on somewhere below, out of the director's direct sight. In good times, this works well enough. The board provides oversight, the executives provide management, and the arrangement hums along. But it contains a permanent danger, which is that the respectable name at the top can end up lending its respectability to conduct the respectable man never fully saw and would never have approved. The prestige flows in one direction, and the responsibility, when things go wrong, flows in the other, and the man discovers that he is accountable for a business he was only ever half watching. Angus Ogilvy was exactly such a man, on exactly such boards, in exactly that world, and for most of a decade it served him admirably. He was respected, he was busy, he was successful, he was his own man with his own achievements, just as he had insisted on being when he turned down the title. He had built the independent life he wanted. And then one of the many companies whose board he sat on turned out to be doing things that a government would eventually denounce in Parliament, and the whole logic of the respectable director, the whole arrangement by which he lent his good name to enterprise after enterprise, came back on him with devastating force, because his good name had been lent to something that turned out to be very bad indeed, and the fact that he had not been watching closely was, in the end, precisely the charge against him. And then, in the middle of that decade, the image met a company called Lonrho, and the safe pair of hands turned out to be attached to a rather more complicated set of arms. If you are still with me, and I hope you are, do drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from, and give the video a like if you are enjoying it, because it genuinely helps these longer histories reach the people who want them. To understand the Lonrho affair, you have to understand what Lonrho was, and what Lonrho was one of the strangest and most controversial companies in the whole post-war history of British business. The name was a contraction of London and Rhodesian Mining and Land Company, which tells you where it had started, out in colonial Africa, in mining and land. By the 1970s, it had grown into something else entirely, a sprawling conglomerate with interests scattered across dozens of countries, a great tangled empire of mines and plantations and trading houses and motor distributorships and newspapers, most of it in Africa, much of it in parts of Africa where the politics were, to put it gently, delicate. And the man who had built this empire, and who ran it with an iron and highly personal grip, was one of the most extraordinary figures British capitalism produced in the whole of the 20th century, a man named Tiny Rowland. Tiny Rowland was not, despite the nickname, a small man, and he was not, despite the very English world he came to dominate, an entirely conventional Englishman. He had been born abroad, under a different name, of German and Anglo-Dutch parentage, and he had come to Britain and reinvented himself and clawed his way up through sheer nerve and ruthlessness and an almost supernatural instinct for the deal, until he sat at the head of Lonrho as its chief executive, a buccaneer in an age of committeemen, a corporate freebooter operating in the gray zones of a decolonizing Africa, where fortunes were there for the taking by anyone bold enough and unfussy enough to take them. He was brilliant. He was combative. He made enemies the way other men make small talk, and he ran Lonrho less like a modern public company and more like a personal fiefdom, which was, in the end, the source of all the trouble. The story of how Rowland came to run such a thing is worth a moment, because it explains the character of the company he built and the world Ogilvy had wandered into as a director. Rowland was a self-invented man in the most literal sense, a figure who had remade himself entirely, shedding one identity and building another, arriving in Britain from a complicated European background and climbing, through nerve and charm and an absolute refusal to be bound by the ordinary rules of the game, into a position of enormous wealth and power. He took a small, sleepy colonial mining company and, over the years, turned it into a vast trading empire spread across the African continent, buying and building and dealing his way into mines and plantations and car dealerships and hotels and newspapers, wherever there was money to be made and few enough scruples in the way of making it. He operated, by preference, in the parts of Africa that were emerging from colonial rule into independence, the parts where the old order was collapsing and the new one had not yet hardened, where a bold and unsentimental operator could make himself indispensable to new governments and old interests alike, playing every side, keeping every door open, answerable, as far as he was concerned, to no one but himself. He was a genuinely formidable and genuinely divisive figure, admired by some as a brilliant entrepreneur who understood Africa when the stuffy men of the city did not, condemned by others as a buccaneer who would deal with anyone and do almost anything for advantage. He collected feuds the way other men collect stamps. In later years, long after the events that concern this story, he would wage a legendary and bottomless war against the Egyptian businessman Muhammad al-Fayed over the ownership of the House of Fraser and its jewel, the Harrods department store, a feud so bitter and so prolonged that it became one of the great business grudge matches of the age. He would come to own the Observer newspaper and use it, his critics said, as a weapon in his commercial battles. He was, in short, not a man who did things quietly or by the book, and Lonhro was the extension of his personality, a company run on his instincts and his relationships and his appetite, a company that made a great deal of money and cut a great many corners and operated, always, at the edges of what was acceptable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This was the enterprise on whose board Angus Ogilvy sat. And it is not hard to see, in retrospect, how a respectable establishment director and a freebooting corporate adventurer were eventually going to find themselves on opposite sides of a catastrophe. Ogilvy was a man of the rules, formed by a family that had made discretion and propriety its whole identity. Rowland was a man who regarded the rules as obstacles to be gone around. For a while they coexisted, the respectable directors lending their names and the driving executive doing the deals, but it was an unstable combination, and it was always going to come apart. When it did come apart, it came apart in the most public way imaginable, and it dragged the respectable director's very respectable name straight into the wreckage, and Angus Ogilvy was on the board. He had joined Lonhro years before, as a director, part of that world of company boards he had built his career in. And for a good while, being a Lonhro director was simply one of many respectable things a respectable city man did. But Rowland's way of running the company, the deals he did, the places he did them, and above all the almost total control he exercised over an enterprise that was, on paper, answerable to its board and its shareholders, was building toward a reckoning. And the reckoning came, in the most spectacular fashion, in the early 1970s, when a group of Lonhro's own directors, appalled by how the company was being run and by what they were learning about Rowland's arrangements, tried to remove him. This was the boardroom war, and it was extraordinary theater. A faction of directors moved against the chief executive. The chief executive fought back with everything he had. It spilled into the courts. And in the course of the legal battle, a great deal of detail about how Lonhro actually operated came pouring out into public view. Details about executive pay and offshore arrangements, and the ways in which enormous sums were moved around the world through structures designed to keep them out of sight of the tax authorities and, in some cases, out of sight of the shareholders themselves. It was a genuine sensation, a rare glimpse into the machinery of a certain kind of international capitalism, and it made the front pages for weeks. The detail of the boardroom coup deserves setting out, because it is what actually triggered the Prime Minister's famous denunciation, and because it shows the kind of thing Ogilvy had been sitting close to. A group of Lonhro's directors, alarmed by how Rowland was running the company and by the arrangements they were uncovering, moved to remove him, and the attempt turned into open warfare, fought partly in the boardroom and partly, when the boardroom failed, in the courts. And in the course of that fight, the arrangements at the top of the company were dragged into the light, and some of them looked very bad indeed. The most notorious concerned a senior figure in the company, a former conservative cabinet minister, a man who had served at the highest levels of British government and was connected by marriage to the family of Winston Churchill himself. It emerged that this eminent figure had received a very large payment from Lon Ho, a sum reported at the time as somewhere around £130,000, an enormous amount in that era, and that the payment had been routed through a company in the Cayman Islands in a manner that had the effect, and by most accounts the purpose, of avoiding the tax that would ordinarily have been due on it. Take the exact figure and the exact mechanics as reported at the time, rather than as forensically established. But the shape of the thing was clear enough, and the shape of the thing was ugly. Here was a great British company, at the very moment it was tearing itself apart in public, revealed to have been making enormous secret payments to a grandee of the political establishment through an offshore structure designed to keep the taxman away. It touched every nerve the British public possessed about privilege and money and the quiet ways in which the powerful looked after one another. And it was in direct response to these revelations, to this glimpse of how business was really being done at the top of Lon Ho, that Edward Heath rose in the Commons and delivered the line that would define the whole affair. The line about the unpleasant and unacceptable face of capitalism. He was not describing an abstraction. He was describing this, the offshore payment to the political grandee, the boardroom war, the whole spectacle of a company that had lost any sense of the propriety a public company was supposed to observe. Roland, for what it is worth, survived the coup. He fought off the directors who had tried to remove him, rallied the shareholders to his side, and emerged still in command of the company he had built, which tells you a good deal about the force of the man and the loyalty and fear he could command in roughly equal measure. But the damage to Lon Ho's reputation, and to the reputations of the people associated with it, was done and could not be undone. The company was now, permanently, the unacceptable face of capitalism, and everyone whose name appeared on its board was now, permanently, associated with that phrase. For most of the directors, this was an embarrassment. For one of them, it was rather more than an embarrassment, because one of them was married to the Queen's first cousin, and the phrase that had attached itself to his company had, by extension, attached itself to the royal family. And the worst of it, for Angus Ogilvy, had not even arrived yet. The boardroom war and the Heath quotation were the public spectacle. The official verdict, the one delivered in cold governmental prose a few years later, would be the thing that actually broke his career. It was in the middle of this that the most famous single sentence of the whole affair was spoken, and it was spoken not by a journalist but by the Prime Minister. Edward Heath, standing in the House of Commons in 1973, responding to the revelations about how Lon Ho conducted itself, described the whole business as the unpleasant and unacceptable face of capitalism. The phrase, usually shortened to the unacceptable face of capitalism, stuck instantly and permanently. It became one of the defining political phrases of the decade, and it attached itself, forever, to Lon Ho, to Roland, and to everyone associated with them, which now included, in the public mind and increasingly in the newspapers, a director named Angus Ogilvy, the husband of Princess Alexandra, the man who had married into the royal family. You can perhaps begin to feel the discomfort radiating out from Buckingham Palace at this point. Here was the reliable, scandal-free branch of the family, the one that had been held up for a decade as the model of how a modern royal should live. And the husband of that model princess was now a director of the company the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom had just denounced in Parliament as the unacceptable face of capitalism. The whole point of the Ogilvy marriage, the whole reason it had been such a relief, was that it did not generate this kind of thing. And now it was generating exactly this kind of thing, on the front pages, with no obvious way to make it stop. But the boardroom war and the Heath quotation were only the beginning of the difficulty for Ogilvy personally. The real blow came a few years later, and it came from the government itself, in the form of an official investigation. The Department of Trade appointed inspectors to examine the affairs of Lonho, to get to the bottom of how the company had really been run and what its directors had really done, and in 1976 the inspectors produced their report. It was long and detailed and damning, and it did not spare the board. And among the directors it criticized was Angus Ogilvy. Here again it is important to be precise and fair, because the specifics matter and because a living reputation and the memory of a dead man are both involved. So treat the exact characterizations as reported and worth checking against the report itself. The central charge against Ogilvy, as it has generally been understood, was not one of dishonesty. The report did not, as far as the widely circulated accounts go, accuse him of lining his own pockets or of deliberate wrongdoing. The charge was, in essence, one of negligence, of failing in his duty as a director, of not doing what a director is supposed to do, which is to know what the company is doing and to stop it doing what it should not. And the particular matter on which this failure was said to be most serious concerned Rhodesia. Rhodesia is the key to why this was so much more than an ordinary corporate embarrassment, why it carried a genuine moral charge. Rhodesia, the country that is now Zimbabwe, had in 1965 made its unilateral declaration of independence under Ian Smith, breaking away from British authority rather than move toward majority rule, entrenching the rule of its white minority over its black majority. Britain and the wider international community had responded with sanctions, an attempt to strangle the breakaway regime economically and force it to the table. And a great deal of the effort of the sanctions was aimed at oil, at cutting off the fuel the regime needed to function. To breach those sanctions, to help supply that regime, was not merely a commercial matter. It was to prop up a government that most of the world, and the British government specifically, regarded as illegitimate and morally indefensible. And Lonho, deeply enmeshed in the economy of southern Africa, was found by the inspectors to have been involved in matters touching on exactly this, on the machinery by which the Rhodesian regime kept itself supplied despite the sanctions. The precise details of who did what and how much any individual director knew are the sort of thing that fills chapters of the report, and that ought to be read in the original rather than summarized from memory. But the shape of the finding as it reached the public was clear enough and damaging enough. The princess's husband had been a director of a company found to have been mixed up in sanctions breaking that helped sustain a white minority regime in Africa, and he had been criticized by government inspectors for failing to prevent it, for not knowing what he should have known, for negligence in his duty. The Rhodesia dimension is worth dwelling on a little further, because it is what gave the whole affair its moral weight, and because it connected Ogilvy's private business trouble to one of the genuinely serious questions of the age. Sanctions busting against Rhodesia was not some technical breach of an obscure regulation. It was, in the eyes of the British government and most of the international community, active collaboration with an outlaw regime built on the entrenched rule of a white minority over a disenfranchised black majority. A regime that had broken away from Britain precisely in order to avoid moving toward racial equality. To help keep that regime supplied, to help it evade the economic pressure that was meant to bring it down, was to take a side in one of the defining moral struggles of the post-war world, and to take the wrong one. And the effort to strangle Rhodesia economically had come to focus, above all, on oil, on cutting off the fuel without which a modern state cannot function, which meant that the machinery of sanctions busting was, to a very large degree, the machinery of getting oil into a country that was supposed to be denied it. What made this even more explosive was the growing suspicion, which would be confirmed in later official inquiries, that the sanctions busting was not the work of a few rogue operators, but was in fact widespread, systematic, and quietly tolerated at levels that should have known far better. It would eventually emerge, in separate investigations, that major and respectable oil companies had been supplying Rhodesia in breach of the sanctions, through arrangements and subsidiaries and cutouts, apparently with a degree of official awareness that made the whole public policy of sanctions look, in retrospect, like something of a charade. The point, for our purposes, is that the world Lonhro operated in, the world of Southern African commerce during the sanctions years, was a world thoroughly compromised by this quiet, widespread evasion, a world in which propriety and profit pulled violently in opposite directions, and in which a great many respectable names got closer to the compromise than they would ever have wished to admit. Ogilvys' misfortune was to be one of the names that got caught, formally, in an official report, with his royal marriage guaranteeing that the catching would be front-page news. And this is where the Commonwealth dimension turned an embarrassment into something closer to a genuine problem of state. The British monarchy was not merely the monarchy of the United Kingdom. It was the head of a commonwealth that included a large and growing number of newly independent nations, many of them in Africa, many of them acutely conscious of the colonial past and watching closely to see whether the old imperial power, and the crown that symbolized it, had truly changed. The Queen took the Commonwealth extraordinarily seriously, regarded it as one of the central duties of her reign, worked hard to be seen as the head of a family of nations that had left the injustices of empire behind. And the whole delicate project of that modern Commonwealth depended on the monarchy being seen to be unambiguously on the right side of exactly the questions that Rhodesia raised, on the side of majority rule and racial equality and the end of white minority regimes. For a member of the royal family, even a member by marriage, even a private businessman rather than a working royal, to be publicly named in connection with sanctions busting that propped up the Rhodesian regime was therefore not just personally awkward. It struck at something the monarchy genuinely could not afford to have questioned, its standing in the very Commonwealth it was trying to hold together. No wonder the family absorbed the blow in such complete and disciplined silence. There was nothing useful to say, and a great deal of harm that saying anything might do. For a man in Ogilvy's position, married into a family that was the constitutional head not just of Britain, but of a commonwealth that included many newly independent African nations, this was close to catastrophic. The monarchy's whole standing in the modern Commonwealth rested on its being seen to be above exactly this kind of thing, above the old colonial cruelties, on the right side of the movement toward majority rule and racial equality. And here was a member of the royal family, by marriage, publicly named in connection with the opposite. Ogilvy's response, to his considerable credit, was not to fight or to bluster or to hide behind his royal connection. He accepted the criticism. He resigned. And he did not resign from one board. He resigned from a great many of them, dozens of directorships, effectively withdrawing from the corporate life he had spent his career building and had turned down a title in order to protect. It was, in its way, an honorable response, the response of a man taking responsibility rather than dodging it, and it should be recorded as such. But it was also a devastating personal defeat. The whole justification for his unusual position, the whole reason he had insisted on remaining his own man with his own career, had been that career itself, and now the career was in ruins, brought down by association with the unacceptable face of capitalism. The man who had declined to be a kept royal in order to keep his independence had lost his independence anyway, and lost it in the most public and humiliating way available. His health, which had never been robust, suffered under all of it. He had heart trouble, and the strain of the affair cannot have helped, and the years around the report were, by every account, a low and difficult period. A man in his 40s watching the edifice of his professional life come down around him, while the newspapers picked over the wreckage and the palace, one imagines, watched with a discomfort it was far too disciplined ever to express in public. And that is the point worth dwelling on, the point that connects the Lonhro affair back to the whole theme of this story. The family absorbed it, silently, the way the family absorbed everything. There was no royal statement, no defense, no acknowledgement, no drama. The institution did what the institution always did with an embarrassment it could not make disappear. It said nothing, it changed the subject, it waited, and it let the passage of time do the work that no statement could do. Alexandra continued her engagements. The couple continued their life. The image of the reliable, scandal-free Ogilvys was quietly patched back together, and within a few years, with the report receding into memory, most of the public had forgotten that the princess's husband had ever been anywhere near the unacceptable face of capitalism at all. And here is the deep irony, the one that makes the Lonhro affair more than just a footnote. The family that had to absorb this, the family that deployed the great machinery of royal silence to smother the embarrassment of Angus Ogilvy, was Angus Ogilvy's own family. This was the household his grandmother had served, the household his brother would soon run as Lord Chamberlain, the household whose entire culture of discretion the Earleys had helped to build and maintain across 3 generations. The Ogilvys had spent a century keeping the crown's secrets. And now, for the first time, the machinery of secret-keeping had to be turned inward, deployed to protect one of their own, to keep an Ogilvy embarrassment off the front pages, the way it had kept so many Windsor embarrassments off the front pages before. The keepers of the secrets had become, for once, the subject of them. They managed it, more or less. Angus rebuilt his life, slowly, in a direction that turned out to be genuinely admirable, and we will come to that, because it matters for the final reckoning. But the Lonhro affair had established something that would echo through the rest of the family's story. It had shown that the serene image of the Ogilvy marriage was exactly that, an image, a carefully maintained surface, and that beneath it the same human troubles pressed as pressed, beneath every other marriage in that family and out of it. The fairy tale had held, but it had held because it was being held up, deliberately, by people who knew precisely how to do that, and who had been doing it for 3 generations. And then, a little over a decade after Lonho, the trouble came again. Only this time it came from inside the house, from the couple's own daughter, and this time no amount of institutional discretion could keep it off the front page, because this time the person causing the trouble wanted it on the front page. She put it there herself. To understand the Marina Ogilvy affair, and to understand it fairly rather than cruelly, you have to go back to that strange in-between status we noted at the wedding. The status that came from Angus declining a title. Marina Ogilvy grew up as a very particular kind of person, a royal who was not a royal, a granddaughter of a king who was, in every formal sense, a commoner. She was Miss Marina Ogilvy. She was not a princess, not a royal highness, not a lady, nothing. And yet she was unmistakably royal in the eyes of the public and the press, the daughter of the beloved Princess Alexandra, present at the great family occasions, a face in the balcony crowd, a name in the papers, close enough to the throne to be interesting and too far from it to be protected. It is genuinely difficult to imagine a stranger position to grow up in, and it is worth pausing to feel the difficulty of it before we get to the scandal, because the scandal makes a good deal more sense once you have. The working royals, the princes and princesses with their titles and their duties, had a role, a structure, a machine around them, a purpose handed to them at birth, whether they wanted it or not. And the fully private descendants of royalty, the ones a few steps further out, had genuine anonymity, real privacy, ordinary lives. But Marina had neither. She had the exposure of royalty without the role, the visibility without the structure, the surname that meant nothing in law and everything to a photographer. She was famous for being the daughter of somebody famous, without any of the institutional scaffolding that might have told her what she was supposed to do about it, and without any of the protection that scaffolding provided. It sharpens the point to set Marina beside the other grandchildren of kings who occupied the outer rings of the family in those years, because they show how differently the same distance from the throne could be handled, and how badly Marina's particular version of it had been set up. Consider her near contemporaries, the children of Princess Margaret. Because Margaret's husband had accepted the earldom of Snowdon, their son and daughter grew up with courtesy titles of their own, a viscount and a lady, positioned within the peerage, given a rank and a name that placed them clearly in the established order. They were minor royals with a defined slot, titled, recognized, part of the aristocratic structure even as they lived largely private lives. Or consider the descendants of an earlier royal daughter, the children of King George V's own daughter, who had married an earl, and whose sons therefore carried the family's title and moved through life as noblemen. In each of these cases, the man had taken or held a peerage, and the peerage had done its quiet work of placing the children, giving them a rung to stand on, a category to belong to. Marina and her brother had none of that, because their father had declined the very thing that would have provided it. They were the grandchildren of a king who were, in the eyes of every rule that governed such things, simply commoners, plain Mr. and plain Miss, with a famous mother and no title of their own, and no defined place in the order of precedence beyond the one their royal blood informally lent them. And there was no fixing it later, because when honor finally came to their father, it came in a form that could not be passed down. A knighthood is a personal distinction. It makes the man a sir and his wife, if he has one, a lady, and it stops there. It confers nothing on the children. So even after Angus became Sir Angus, his son and daughter remained exactly what they had always been, plain Ogilvys, royal by blood and common by every rule, occupying that undefined and undefended space that no peerage had ever been raised to fill. For a person of a settled and private temperament, like James, this could be lived with, even enjoyed, a kind of freedom from the whole apparatus of expectation. But for a person who felt the exposure without feeling the belonging, who was watched like a royal but placed nowhere, who had the visibility that draws photographers and none of the machinery that manages them, it was a genuinely difficult inheritance, and it is not hard to see how it could curdle into a sense of being neither one thing nor the other, of being famous for a family one did not quite belong to, of carrying the burdens of royalty without any of its supports. That was Marina's position when she fell in love with the wrong man and found herself pregnant and unmarried and at war with her parents. She was royal enough that the whole country would want to read about it, and common enough that no palace machine existed to protect her from the reading. It was the worst of both conditions, and it had been arranged, with the kindest of intentions, at the wedding a quarter of a century before her own. Her brother James seems to have navigated this position with relative ease, going quietly into business and a private life, keeping his head down, drawing no attention. But people are different, and what one sibling absorbs without apparent difficulty, another finds intolerable, and there is no shame in that, and no mystery about it either. Marina was, by all the accounts of the period, a more restless and artistic and searching young woman than her brother, drawn to a more bohemian world than the one she had been raised in, chafing, in the way that the young often chafe, against the expectations and the reserve of a very proper family. And in the late 1980s, in her early 20s, she fell in love with a man her family did not choose for her, and everything came apart. The man was Paul Mowat, and it is important to describe him accurately rather than through the sneering lens the tabloids reached for at the time. He was a photographer and a musician, a drummer, a man from outside the world of castles and country weekends, a person of ordinary background rather than aristocratic one. In another family, in another decade, none of that would have mattered in the slightest. In this family, in this position, with this history, it mattered enormously, or at least it was made to matter. And in 1989, the situation acquired the one element guaranteed to turn a private disapproval into a public crisis. Marina became pregnant. She was not married, and her family, according to the account she herself gave, did not take it at all well. Now we reach the part that has to be handled with real care, because almost everything we know about what happened inside the family in those weeks comes from one source, and that source is Marina herself, speaking to a newspaper, in the middle of the crisis, in a state of considerable distress and considerable anger. That does not make her account false. It does not make it true either. It makes it one side of a private family conflict, told by the party who chose to make it public, and it should be weighed as exactly that, as her account, contested and uncorroborated by the other people in the room, who did what that family always did and said nothing. What Marina told the newspaper, the tabloid Today, in the autumn of 1989, was explosive. She said, in essence, that when she had told her parents she was pregnant, they had reacted not with support but with fury and horror. She indicated that she had been pressed, in the strongest terms, to resolve the situation in one of two ways, either by ending the pregnancy or by marrying quickly to make it respectable. She spoke of feeling rejected by her own mother and father, of being made to feel that she and her unborn child were an embarrassment to be managed, rather than a daughter and a grandchild to be welcomed. She described threats concerning money, the withdrawal of support. And she said all of this to a national newspaper, on the record, with photographs, in a manner that was completely without precedent for a member of that family. Royals and royal-adjacent people did not do this. They did not air the family's private business in the tabloids. They did not accuse their own parents in print. The entire culture of the family, the culture the Ogilvys had helped to define, was built on the absolute opposite of this, on saying nothing, ever, to anyone. And here was Princess Alexandra's own daughter saying everything to everyone, at the top of her voice. It matters, in understanding how this happened, to remember what the newspapers were like at that particular moment, because the late 1980s were a specific and febrile time in the relationship between the royal family and the British press, and Marina's story landed in the middle of it. The old deferential arrangement, in which the papers had largely left the private lives of royals alone, had been breaking down for years, and by the end of the 1980s it had collapsed almost entirely. The tabloids were locked in a ferocious circulation war, and they had discovered that nothing sold papers like the royal family, and specifically like the royal family in difficulty. The appetite was enormous and growing, and it was about to become insatiable, because within a few years the marriage of the heir to the throne would come apart in the most public and lucrative scandal in the whole history of the institution, a feeding frenzy of leaked tapes and confessional books and warring briefings that would consume the early 1990s. Marina's story, in the autumn of 1989, was in a sense an early tremor of the earthquake that was coming, a sign that the ground had shifted, that a royal, or a royal-adjacent figure, in distress, could now expect not discreet sympathy, but a bidding war. And that shift created a genuinely new possibility, one that had not really existed for previous generations of troubled royals, which was that the person in difficulty could now go on the offensive, could seize the narrative, could pick up the telephone and sell, or at least tell, their own version before anyone else could shape it for them. For someone in Marina's position, isolated, exposed, at war with a family that commanded far more institutional power than she did, and that would, she clearly felt, simply crush her version in silence if she let it, the newspapers offered something the family never would, which was a voice. If the palace was going to say nothing and let the machinery of discretion define her as the difficult daughter who had embarrassed her saintly mother, then the newspapers offered her the chance to define herself first, to say her piece, to make her grievance heard in the one forum where the family could not simply outweigh her. Whether that was wise, whether it served her well in the long run, whether the papers that gave her a voice also used her for their own purposes and discarded her afterward, are all fair questions, and the answers are not flattering to the newspapers. But the logic of it, from where she stood, is not hard to follow. She had one weapon that the mighty machine of royal discretion could not neutralize, and it was the willingness to talk, and she used it. The tragedy, and it is a genuine tragedy rather than a scandal to be relished, is that this weapon cut in every direction at once. It gave Marina her voice, but it also exposed her more completely, handed her most painful private experience to an industry that would squeeze it dry, and set her permanently against a family whose good opinion she may, underneath the anger, have badly wanted. It embarrassed her parents, but it also embarrassed her, laying out for public consumption a family rupture that no one involved could ever fully take back. There are no winners in a story like this, only a young woman in an impossible position reaching for the one form of power available to her, and a family with a great deal of power reaching, as it always did, for silence, and the two of them meeting in the pages of a tabloid where nothing good was ever going to come of it. The machinery of discretion had finally met its match, not in a more powerful institution, but in a single person who simply would not be quiet, and there was nothing the most secret-keeping family in Britain could do about it, except wait for the noise to pass. The effect was seismic, in its quiet way. For the palace, and for Alexandra personally, it was close to a nightmare. Consider the specific cruelty of the timing and the symmetry. Alexandra had spent her entire adult life as the royal who never caused trouble, the safe pair of hands, the answer to the family's anxieties about scandal, the living proof that a royal marriage could be normal and happy and free of drama. She had built that reputation over 25 years of patient, unglamorous work, and now her own child had detonated, in the most public forum available, exactly the kind of scandal that Alexandra had spent a quarter of a century not causing. The mother was the model of discretion. The daughter had gone to the tabloids. It was as if the family's whole carefully maintained image had been designed specifically so that this particular breach of it would hurt as much as possible. And crucially, there was very little the institution could do. This was the difference between the Lawn Row affair and the Marina affair, and it is the difference that the whole strange status of the Ogilvy children had been quietly setting up for decades. When Angus was embarrassed by Lonho, the family could absorb it in silence, because Angus was a disciplined man who played by the family's rules, who resigned quietly and said nothing, and let the machinery do its work. The machinery of silence works, but it only works when everyone involved agrees to be silent. It has no power at all over a person who refuses to be silent, who wants the noise, who has picked up the telephone and called the newspaper. And Marina had done precisely that. She was royal enough to make it a scandal, and too far outside the machine to be controlled by it. The very in-between status that had once looked like a gift, the freedom of the non-royal royal, turned out to contain this. The freedom to blow the whole thing up, and no palace apparatus with the power to stop her. The family did the only thing it could, which was to endure it, in public silence, while presumably conducting a great deal of anguished business in private. There was no royal statement attacking the daughter, obviously. There was no public defense, no counter-narrative, no answering interview from Alexandra or Angus, because to engage would have been to prolong it and to legitimize it, and the family's every instinct ran the other way, towards starving the story of the oxygen of a response. So the parents said nothing, publicly, which the tabloids naturally read as tacit confirmation, And the story ran and ran. The estranged princess's daughter, the pregnancy, the rift, the pressure, the whole raw human mess of it, splashed across the papers for weeks, entirely beyond the control of the most discreet family in Britain. And then, in the way these things sometimes do, it began to resolve, or at least to move toward resolution, because a baby was coming and a wedding was, one way or another, going to happen. Marina and Paul Mowat were married in the early part of 1990, on the 2nd of February, at St. Andrew's Church in Ham, near Richmond, not far from the Royal Park where Marina had grown up. And here we arrive at the second of the two weddings, the one the title of this whole account has been pointing toward, and the contrast with the first could hardly be more complete. There is a question about who attended that wedding, and it is a question the record answers less cleanly than one would like, so treat what follows as the reported version rather than the certain one. What seems clear is that in the weeks between the newspaper explosion of the autumn and the wedding of the winter, some measure of reconciliation took place, some patching of the terrible breach, enough that the wedding was not the total family boycott the earlier headlines might have suggested. The reported accounts of the time indicate that Alexandra and Angus did, in the end, attend their daughter's wedding, that the rift had been mended sufficiently for the parents to be present at the marriage of their pregnant daughter to the man they had not chosen. If that is right, and it appears to be, then it is to the family's credit, a sign that whatever fury and horror had been expressed in private, the human bonds had held enough to bring the parents to the church. But it should be flagged that the interior of that reconciliation, what was actually said and felt and forgiven, is exactly the kind of private family matter that this family never discussed. And so we are left, as we always are with the Ogilvys, looking at the surface and guessing at the depths. What is certain is the character of the occasion, and its character was everything the 1963 wedding had not been. The first wedding was Westminster Abbey. 200 million watchers, the massed apparatus of the state, a story the whole nation was invited to celebrate. The second wedding was a small suburban church, a bride heavily pregnant, a groom the family had resisted, a shadow of tabloid scandal hanging over the whole thing, and a marriage that the family would very much have preferred to conduct in as much privacy as could be managed. The first wedding was a performance for the world. The second was an attempt to get through a difficult day with as little further damage as possible. One was a fairy tale. The other was the thing the fairy tale was supposed to have made impossible. This is the marriage the Ogilvys hid, in the sense that the title means it. Not hidden as in secret, because it was in all the papers. Hidden as in disowned, downplayed, kept at arm's length, never celebrated, never woven into the official family story the way a royal wedding is supposed to be woven in. It was a marriage the family had, in effect, been dragged to, born out of a scandal they had tried and failed to prevent, and they treated it accordingly, with the minimum of ceremony and the maximum of privacy, and then, once it was done, with the family's characteristic silence. A daughter was born to Marina and Paul that spring, a granddaughter for Alexandra and Angus, and a son followed a few years later. And whatever the private feelings had been, grandchildren have a way of softening even the hardest family breaches, and the reasonable inference, though it is only an inference, is that the wounds healed over time the way most family wounds do, imperfectly and quietly, and without anyone ever saying so on the record. The marriage itself, the one that had caused such a storm, did not, in the end, last. Marina and Paul Moet divorced before the decade was out, their union ending in the ordinary way that so many unions end, without further public drama, the great scandal of 1989 subsiding at last into the private disappointment of a marriage that simply had not worked. Marina's later life was, by the accounts that exist, not an easy one, and she is a living private person who has had enough of her difficulties conducted in public, so this account will leave her there, at the point where the noise died down, with only the observation that the young woman at the center of the storm was, throughout, a person in a genuinely painful and genuinely impossible situation, and that whatever one makes of her decision to go to the newspapers, the impossibility of her position was not of her own making. It was made for her, years before, by a decision about titles taken by two people who loved her and thought they were doing her a kindness. Because that, in the end, is one of the quiet tragedies buried in this story, and it is worth stating plainly. The decision that Angus took in 1963 to decline a title and let his children be commoners was taken with the best of intentions, out of a genuine wish to spare those children the burden of royalty. It was praised at the time as wise and modern, and there was real wisdom in it. But it also placed those children in that exposed and unprotected middle position, royal enough to be hunted, private enough to be undefended, and when the crisis came for Marina, that position was part of what made the crisis so unmanageable. Nobody could have foreseen it in the spring of the wedding. But the seeds of the second wedding's misery were, in a sense, planted at the first wedding, in a decision meant as a gift. That is not a moral failing on anyone's part. It is just the way that consequences unspool across decades, the way that a choice made in love and good judgment can produce, 25 years later, a result its makers would have been horrified to imagine. Before we sum up, it is worth stepping back and seeing where the Ogilvy troubles sit in the longer story of how the monarchy managed its embarrassments across the whole of the 20th century. Because the two Ogilvy scandals turn out to sit precisely on the hinge between an old world and a new one, and they show, better than almost any other example, the exact moment when the family's ancient method of survival stopped working. That method, refined over generations, tended and enforced by the very Airlie family this story keeps returning to, was fundamentally simple. When something embarrassing happened, you said nothing. You did not confirm, you did not deny, you did not explain, you did not engage. You let the storm blow itself out against a wall of silence, and you trusted that time, the great ally of the institution, would do the rest, would carry the public's attention elsewhere, would allow the embarrassment to sink slowly out of memory while the family carried on with its duties as though nothing had occurred. Silence and patience. That was the whole art of it, and for a very long time it worked, because the press and the public, however curious, largely accepted that there were doors the family was entitled to keep closed. You can watch this method succeed across the decades. The abdication itself, the greatest embarrassment of all, was in a sense managed this way in the years that followed. The exiled Duke of Windsor kept quietly at a distance, the whole painful business allowed to fade from the center of national life, while the new king and queen rebuilt the institution's dignity through sheer patient duty. The private difficulties of Alexandra's own father, the glamorous Duke of Kent, were managed this way, kept out of view, absorbed into the family's practiced silence, and largely forgotten. And the Lonhro affair, when it came, was managed this way too, and managed successfully. Angus Ogilvy played his part in the old system perfectly. He said little, he resigned his positions, he took his punishment, he made no scenes, and he trusted the family's method to see him through. And it did. He kept his marriage, kept his dignity, rebuilt his life, and within a few years the public had largely forgotten that the princess's husband had ever been named in a government report at all. The wall of silence held, time did its work, and the embarrassment sank out of sight exactly as the method promised. Lonhro was the old world, and in the old world the method worked. Marina's story was the new world, and in the new world the method failed completely, because the method had always depended on one thing that could no longer be guaranteed, which was the cooperation of everyone involved. Silence only works if everyone stays silent. Patience only works if the storm has no one inside it feeding it. The whole apparatus of managed embarrassment rested, in the end, on the assumption that the people at the center of any scandal would themselves want it suppressed, would share the family's interest in making it disappear, would play, as Angus had played, by the rules. And Marina did not share that interest and did not play by those rules, because Marina was not, in the way that mattered, inside the system at all. She was the exposed and undefended one, the royal who was not a royal, and she had concluded, rightly or wrongly, that the system's silence would be used against her rather than for her. So she broke the silence herself, and the moment she did, the entire method collapsed, because there is no defense against a person who wants the storm, who is standing in the middle of it with a megaphone, who has decided that noise serves her better than quiet. The family could be as silent as it liked. It made no difference at all when the person at the center would not be. And this, as it happened, was exactly the lesson the whole institution was about to learn, on a vastly larger and more devastating scale, in the years immediately following. Marina's rupture in 1989 was a small early tremor. The earthquake arrived in the early 1990s, when the marriage of the heir to the throne disintegrated in public, and both parties to it and their allies discovered the same thing Marina had discovered, that the newspapers offered a voice the palace could not silence, that a royal in distress could now seize the narrative rather than submit to the family's discretion. The leaked tapes, the confessional book, the extraordinary television interviews, the warring briefings, the whole spectacle of the family's most private agonies laid out for public consumption, all of it was the method failing on the grandest possible scale, the wall of silence breached again and again by people on the inside who would no longer stay quiet. The monarchy came closer to real crisis in those years than at any time since the abdication, and it came close precisely because its ancient method of managing embarrassment had stopped working, because silence and patience are useless against people who choose to speak. And here, one final time, the heirly thread ties the whole thing together, almost too neatly to be believed. Because the man tasked with holding the royal household together through that catastrophe, the man running the machine while the method collapsed around it, the Lord Chamberlain steering the monarchy through the worst years it had known, was David Ogilvy, Angus's own brother, the head of the very family that had spent a century perfecting the method that was now failing. The Ogilvys had made the keeping of royal secrets their hereditary trade, and they were present, in the person of one brother, at the exact moment the trade became impossible, at the highest level, in the middle of the storm. And they were present, in the person of the other brother's family, among the early casualties of the New World, when Marina proved, before Diana ever did, that the wall of silence could be walked straight through by anyone willing to talk. It is one of the strangest symmetries in the whole modern history of the crown. The family that guarded the secrets was there when the secrets could no longer be guarded, both as the guardians and as the guarded, watching their own ancient art fail in their own hands. And so we come to the reckoning, to the question of what the whole thing actually amounts to, this tale of two weddings and the marriage in between. Start with the marriage itself, the central one, Alexandra and Angus, because it deserves to be given its due before the ironies close in around it. It lasted, in the end, more than 40 years, from that Abbey wedding in 1963 until Angus's death, and by every account that exists it was, for all those years, a genuinely good and genuinely close marriage, a real partnership between two people who suited each other. That is not nothing. In a family that has produced an extraordinary number of unhappy marriages, broken marriages, marriages that curdled into cold performance or exploded into public scandal, Alexandra and Angus managed the rarest thing of all, which was a marriage that simply worked, quietly, durably, for 4 decades, out of the spotlight, without drama. Whatever else this account has to say about the troubles that surrounded that marriage, the marriage at the center was sound, and the two people in it earned, through decades of loyalty to each other, the affection in which they were held. Alexandra earned her own place too, separately, through work. The reputation she had as one of the hardest working and most reliable members of the royal family was not manufactured by the palace publicity machine. It was real. She carried, for decades, an enormous and largely invisible load of the duties that keep the institution alive, the patronages and the visits and the endless, unremarkable public occasions that generate no headlines and win no glory and matter enormously all the same. She did it without complaint, without seeking credit, without the appetite for attention that has undone so many of her relatives. She was, in the truest sense, a working royal, and the work was genuine, and it should be remembered alongside the scandals rather than buried under them. Angus, too, earned a genuine rehabilitation, and it is one of the more quietly moving parts of the whole story, so it deserves to be told properly. After the wreckage of Lonho, after the loss of his business life and the public humiliation of the report, he did not retreat into bitterness or idleness. He turned instead to charitable work, and specifically to the cause of helping young people, and in particular young people from difficult circumstances, to build something of their own. He gave himself to the work of youth enterprise, to schemes designed to help the young start businesses and find footholds and make their way, the very thing that his own privileged path had never required him to struggle for. The details of exactly which organizations and which roles are worth checking against the record, but the shape of the second half of his life is not in doubt. The man who had been named in a government report over the unacceptable face of capitalism spent his later years trying to build a more acceptable one young entrepreneur at a time, and the effort was recognized. He was knighted, late in the 1980s, becoming Sir Angus Ogilvy, an honor that marked not the marriage of his youth, but the charitable labor of his maturity, the second act that redeemed the wreckage of the first. It is a genuinely admirable arc, a man who took a public disgrace and answered it not with excuses but with decades of quiet good work, and it is worth setting down clearly, because it is the part of the story that the scandal narrative tends to leave out. He died in the last days of 2004, on the 26th of December, Boxing Day, the day after his wife's birthday, at the age of 76. There is a particular poignancy in the timing that no one designed and no one could have wanted. A man dying in the middle of the family's Christmas, the day after the woman he had married on Christmas Day so many years before had marked another year. Alexandra was left a widow, as her own mother had been left a widow, as the women of that family across the generations had so often been left, to carry on alone. And carry on she did, in the way she had always done things, quietly, dutifully, without spectacle, gradually reducing her public role as age and ill health made their claims, retreating at last into the private life she had earned, out of the glare, where she remains. So what is the secret then? The one the title promises, the thing the Ogilvys hid. It is not, in the end, a single dramatic secret, a hidden marriage or a buried scandal that one revelation could expose. It is something quieter and, in a way, more universal than that, and it is best understood by looking at the whole shape of the thing at once. The Ogilvy marriage was sold to the public as the marriage that had no secrets, the clean one, the normal one, the reassuring one, the answer to the family's long anxiety about scandal. And the deepest truth of the story is that this image, the image of a life without hidden trouble, was itself the thing being hidden, because there was hidden trouble, of course there was, the same human trouble that presses on every family everywhere. There was the near disgrace of Lon Ho, a member of the royal family named in a government report over sanctions and a white minority regime, an embarrassment that had to be smothered in the family's practiced silence. And there was the rift with Marina, a mother and daughter estranged so bitterly that the estrangement ended up in the tabloids, a scandal that could not be smothered because the person causing it refused to be silent. A wedding conducted in a small church under a cloud, disowned by the very family story it should have been part of. The secret, in other words, was the ordinary human wreckage that lies underneath every carefully maintained surface, and the specific thing the Ogilvys hid was not any one piece of that wreckage, but the labor of hiding it, the constant, unremarked, generational work of keeping the mess off the front page and the serene image intact. And here is the final irony, the one that has been waiting at the end of this whole story, the one that makes the Ogilvys not just another royal family with troubles, but a family whose troubles carry a particular sting. Because of all the families in Britain, the Ogilvys were the ones who knew best how this was done. This was the family of Mabel Airlie, who kept Queen Mary's confidences for 50 years. This was the family of David Ogilvy, the 13th Earl, who ran the entire royal household as Lord Chamberlain through the worst years the modern monarchy has known. This was a family that had made the keeping of royal secrets its inheritance and its trade, that had spent 3 generations helping the House of Windsor smother its embarrassments and maintain its surfaces. And when the trouble came home, when it was an Ogilvy embarrassment that needed smothering, an Ogilvy surface that needed maintaining, they discovered what everyone who has ever tried to keep a secret discovers eventually, that the machinery works beautifully, right up until it meets someone who refuses to cooperate. That silence is a marvelous tool for managing the disciplined, and no tool at all for managing the desperate. That you can keep a man's disgrace quiet if the man will play along, and you can keep almost nothing quiet at all if a frightened young woman with a phone number for a newspaper decides she has had enough. There is a cost to silence that this story keeps circling, and it is worth naming plainly, because it is the human thing underneath all the institutional cleverness. The family's great virtue, the discretion the Earldys had made their trade and Alexandra had made her life, was real and in many ways admirable. It kept the monarchy standing through a century that might otherwise have swept it away. It spared a great many people a great deal of public humiliation. It was, as a method of institutional survival, genuinely effective. But the same discipline that manages an embarrassment can also freeze a family solid, can turn every difficult feeling into something to be suppressed rather than spoken, can make it almost impossible to simply sit down with a frightened daughter and say the plain human things that might have mended the breach before it reached the newspapers. A family that has trained itself, for generations, to say nothing, to keep everything behind the door, to treat every private difficulty as a threat to be contained, is a family that may find, when a real wound opens in its own midst, that it has forgotten how to speak. The very machinery that protected the institution so well may have made the ordinary work of a family, the talking, the forgiving, the reaching toward one another, that much harder. We cannot know what passed between Alexandra and her daughter in private, and it is not ours to guess. But it is fair to observe that a family so practiced in silence was, of all families, perhaps the least equipped to handle a crisis that could only really be solved by talking. Alexandra herself lived on into a quieter age, carrying the code she had been raised in to the end. After Angus died on that Boxing Day in 2004, she was a widow for the long remainder of her life, as her mother had been, as so many of the women of that family had been, and she continued for a time to do the work she had always done, the patronages and the visits, gradually stepping back as age and ill health made their claims, until she withdrew almost entirely from public view into the private life she had earned across half a century of duty. And in withdrawing she became, in a sense, one of the last of her kind, one of the last royals formed entirely by the world that the abdication had made, the world of duty first and silence always, and the private kept strictly out of the public eye. The royals who came after her would live in a different world, the world Marina and then Diana had helped to usher in, a world of confession and exposure and the collapse of the old discretion, a world in which the wall of silence no longer stood and no one really expected it to. Alexandra belonged to the world before that, the world of her mother and her grandmother's generation of courtiers, the world in which the Earldys had kept the Queen's confidences for 50 years, and no one had ever dreamed of picking up the telephone to a newspaper. She kept faith with that world to the last, the princess who behaved, quiet and dutiful and discreet, right up to the edge of an age that had stopped believing in any of it. And so the story of the two weddings is, in the end, the story of that whole vanishing world, caught at the exact moment it began to disappear. The first wedding belonged wholly to the old order, the great abbey spectacle, the managed fairy tale, the discretion that would smother every trouble that followed. The second wedding belonged to the new one, the small church under its tabloid cloud, the daughter who would not be silenced, the method failing in real time. Between them lay a marriage that was genuinely good, and a family that was genuinely skilled at hiding everything a good marriage cannot prevent, and the slow, quiet passage from a world where such hiding worked to a world where it did not. The Ogilvys stood on the seam between the two, keeping secrets with one hand and losing control of them with the other, the last great practitioners of an art that was dying even as they practiced it. 2 weddings, then. The one performed for the world, in the great abbey, watched by millions, the fairy tale that reassured a nervous institution that it could still produce a happy ending. And the one performed to be survived, in a small church, under a cloud, the marriage the family had been dragged to and would spend years pretending had not quite happened. Between them, 40 years of a genuinely good marriage, wrapped in a genuinely maintained image, concealing the same troubles that every family conceals, kept concealed by a family that had spent a century learning how, until the day the concealing failed, as concealing always eventually does, and the whole carefully varnished surface cracked just wide enough for the world to see that underneath the model royal marriage there had only ever been people, doing their best, and sometimes failing, and hiding the failure, the way the Ogilvys had always hidden everyone else's. The tidy version says the Ogilvy marriage was the one without a story. The truer version is that it had 2, and that both of them are about the same thing in the end: the enormous, ceaseless, generational effort it takes to make a family look as though it has no story at all. That was the marriage the Ogilvys hid, not a secret ceremony. The ordinary human truth underneath a very good performance, kept out of sight by the best keepers of secrets the monarchy ever had, right up until the moment it could not be kept out of sight any longer. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.